Something about this situation doesn't sit right, and the more you look at it, the worse it gets. Because what we're seeing right now isn't just a normal quarterback decision. It's not just a team picking one player over another. This feels bigger, messier, and honestly, a little too calculated to ignore. How does a player go from being heavily backed behind the scenes to suddenly being passed on like he was never part of the plan? That's exactly what's happening with Dillon Gabriel. For months, there were strong connections tying him to a system that seemed built for him, a coach who believed in him, a structure that kept giving him chances. Everything pointed toward a long-term vision. And then just like that, it disappeared. No trade, no push, no urgency from his supposed supporters. Especially not from the Atlanta Falcons, the one team that many believed would go all in. Instead, Atlanta stacked their quarterback room with completely different options. Names that weren't even part of the original conversation suddenly became the priority. And the message? Quiet, but loud enough for everyone paying attention. They didn't want him. Now here, where things start to get uncomfortable. Because if Gabriel wasn't the guy, then why was he pushed so hard before? And more importantly, who paid the price for that decision? That's where ShedeurSanders enters the picture. A player who, depending on who you ask, either wasn't ready or was never given a real chance to prove he was. There's been a lot of buzz online. Fans, analysts, even insiders have started questioning how things were handled behind the scenes. Some say it was just a normal competition. Others believe something very different was going on. Rumors suggest that opportunities weren't exactly equal. That momentum shifted in strange ways, that every time one player had a chance to break through, something pulled it back. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. And at the center of all of this sits one name that keeps coming up again and again, Kevin Stefanski. A coach known for his system, his structure, his decisions. But now, those same decisions are being picked apart piece by piece. Because when you connect everything, the reps, the performances, the sudden shift in Atlanta, and the complete silence around Gabriel now, it starts to paint a picture that's hard to ignore. This wasn't just a miss. It might have been a complete misread of talent. Or something even more complicated. And the wild part, the fallout is just getting started. Because while one quarterback's future suddenly looks uncertain, another one might be on the verge of proving everyone wrong in a way the league won't be able to ignore. So the real question is simple. Was this all just bad judgment? Or did something happen behind closed doors that completely changed the direction of multiple careers? Because once you see the full story laid out, it becomes very clear. This wasn't just a decision. It was a turning point. And what comes next could expose everything. The first real sign that something was off didn't come from a press conference or a breaking headline. It came from a reaction that was way too strong to ignore. When the idea of Dillon Gabriel being moved started floating around, you would expect mixed opinions, maybe even some disappointment depending on how people viewed his potential. But that's not what happened. Instead, there was relief. Real, noticeable relief coming out of the Cleveland Browns fanbase and circles around the team. Not subtle, not quiet. It was the kind of reaction that makes you stop and think, why would a team feel better about moving on from a quarterback they invested time in? That kind of response doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It builds over time. And when you look closer, it starts to make more sense. Because throughout his time in Cleveland, Gabriel wasn't just another player trying to find his rhythm. He was consistently being positioned as someone the system believed in. Someone who kept getting chances to prove himself, even when things didn't fully click. And yet, the results didn't match the support. There were moments where the offense looked stuck, drives that went nowhere, decisions that raised eyebrows, nothing catastrophic on its own, but enough to create a pattern people couldn't ignore. And still, the backing didn't change. That's where the frustration started to grow. Fans began noticing that the leash seemed longer for Gabriel than for others. That mistakes didn't carry the same consequences. That opportunities kept coming, even when the momentum wasn't there. Now, to be fair, development takes time. Quarterbacks aren't built overnight. But this didn't feel like patience. It felt selective. And once that idea starts spreading, it's hard to contain. Because naturally, attention shifts to who wasn't getting those same chances. That's when the conversation around ShedeurSanders started getting louder. People began asking questions. Why did it feel like his opportunities were more limited? Why did every appearance feel like a short window instead of a real chance to settle in? And why did the narrative around his performance seem harsher, even in similar situations? Again, nothing officially confirmed, no clear statements. But the perception, it was building fast. And perception in sports can be just as powerful as reality. So when news started circulating that Gabriel might be on the move, that's when everything clicked for a lot of people. Because instead of concern, the dominant feeling was something closer to closure. Like a chapter people were ready to move on from. And that's the red flag. Teams don't usually create that kind of emotional response around a player unless there's been tension beneath the surface, unless expectations didn't match reality, unless decisions started raising more questions than answers. Which leads to an even bigger issue. If Cleveland was ready to move on this easily, what does that say about the decisions that were made to get to this point? Because someone believed in that direction. Someone kept pushing it forward. And once you start following that trail, it leads directly to one place. And what comes next only makes that connection even harder to ignore. Then you get to the part of the story that really made people start questioning everything, what was actually happening inside that quarterback room. On the surface, it looked like a standard competition. Multiple quarterbacks, limited reps, everyone fighting for position. That's how it's supposed to work in the NFL. But according to a growing number of voices around the Cleveland Browns, this didn't feel like a normal battle. It felt managed. And that's where the controversy around ShedeurSanders and Dillon Gabriel really started to take shape. Because when people went back and looked at how things unfolded, certain patterns began to stand out. There's been a lot of buzz suggesting that the distribution of reps wasn't exactly even. That one quarterback seemed to have more room to settle in, more opportunities to recover from mistakes, more chances to stay on the field and build rhythm. Meanwhile, the other. Short windows, quick rotations, moments that felt more like tests than real opportunities. Now, to be clear, none of this has been officially confirmed. Teams rarely disclose that level of internal detail, but the perception has been strong enough that it's become part of the conversation. And perception like that doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from repetition. Fans started noticing that when Gabriel struggled, the narrative stayed patient. Development, timing, adjustment, those were the words being used. But when Shedeur had a rough sequence, the tone felt different. More critical, less forgiving. Again, nothing concrete, but enough to raise eyebrows. And then there's the timing of certain decisions. There were moments where it seemed like momentum could shift. Moments where one good drive or one solid performance could open the door for a bigger role. But just as quickly as that momentum appeared, it disappeared. Rotations changed, opportunities shrank, the reset button got hit. That's why some observers started describing the situation as controlled. Not in a conspiracy sense, but in a way that suggested the outcome might have been leaning in a certain direction all along. Because true competition usually reveals itself over time. The best player separates, the reps increase naturally, the trust builds. But here, it felt like that process never fully played out. And that's what made things uncomfortable. Because if both quarterbacks weren't being evaluated under the same conditions, then what exactly was being measured? Performance, potential, or something else entirely? That question leads straight into the role of Kevin Stefanski. Every rotation, every snap, every opportunity, those decisions don't happen randomly. They come from the top. Which is why so many people started connecting the dots. Was this simply a coach backing the player he believed in? Or was it a situation where belief turned into bias? There's a difference. And in high-stakes environments like the NFL, that difference can change careers. Because while one quarterback was getting extended chances to grow into the role, the other was trying to prove himself in fragments. Small windows, limited rhythm, high pressure. That's not just difficult, it's defining. And if the playing field wasn't level from the start, then the results we saw might not tell the full story. Which makes what happened next even more revealing. Because once you step outside of Cleveland, the entire narrative begins to flip. And then came the move that flipped the entire narrative on its head. Because everything that felt confusing in Cleveland suddenly became even harder to explain once the focus shifted to the Atlanta Falcons. This was supposed to be the moment where things made sense. If the system in Cleveland was truly built around Dillon Gabriel, then a transition to a new situation, especially one connected to Kevin Stefanski, should have reinforced that belief. Right. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Atlanta didn't prioritize Gabriel. They didn't push for him. They didn't even make it look like he was part of their plans. And that silence spoke louder than anything else. Because what the Falcons did instead was stack their quarterback room with completely different options. They brought in Tua Tagovailoa, added Michael Penix Jr., and even included a veteran presence in Trevor Siemian. That's not a team waiting on one guy. That's a team covering every angle. And when you look at that setup, one question immediately jumps out. Where does Gabriel fit into any of this? The answer, at least right now, is nowhere. And that's the part that changes everything. Because if Gabriel was truly the guy in Cleveland, the one worth backing, developing, and prioritizing, then why wouldn't that belief carry over? Why wouldn't there be urgency to bring him into a new system? Why wouldn't there be even a small sign of continuity? Instead, it looks like a complete reset. A clean break. Almost like the previous commitment never existed. Now, some might argue this is just smart roster building, that Atlanta is simply creating competition and depth at the position. And that's fair. But even within competition, there are signals, subtle indications of who a team values, who they're willing to invest in, who they see as part of the future. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. And in this case, Gabriel isn't showing up in any of those signals. Which leads to an uncomfortable possibility. What if the push for Gabriel in Cleveland wasn't as solid as it seemed? What if it wasn't about long-term belief, but something more situational? Because once Atlanta had the chance to build their quarterback room from scratch, they went in a completely different direction. And that decision didn't just impact Gabriel. It reframed everything we thought we knew about the situation. It raised questions about evaluation, about priorities, about whether the earlier decisions were truly about putting the best player in position to succeed. And most importantly, it brought the focus right back to ShedeurSanders. Because if Gabriel was never the long-term answer, then why was he treated like one? Why was the system tilted in his favor? Why were other opportunities limited while he was being pushed forward? Those questions don't go away. If anything, they get louder. Because Atlanta's move didn't just close one door. It exposed everything that happened before it. And now, the spotlight isn't just on the players anymore. It's on the decisions that put them in this position in the first place. And once that spotlight hits, it doesn't fade quietly. And this is where the entire situation starts circling back to one unavoidable question. What exactly was Kevin Stefanski seeing that nobody else was? Because at some point, this stops being about players and starts being about decisions. From the outside, you could argue this was just a misread. Coaches back the wrong guy sometimes. It happens. Evaluating quarterbacks is one of the hardest things to get right at the professional level. But this doesn't feel like a simple miss. It feels layered. Because the commitment to Dillon Gabriel wasn't subtle. It wasn't passive. It was consistent, visible, and at times difficult to explain, especially when the results weren't clearly supporting it. That's why people started asking deeper questions. Not just what happened, but why it happened. There's been a lot of speculation surrounding this, and it's important to keep it in that category. Nothing has been officially confirmed, but the conversations are out there, and they're getting louder. Some believe Stefanski simply trusted his system, that he saw traits in Gabriel that fit what he wanted to build, even if it didn't immediately translate on the field. Others think it may have been a case of overcommitment. Once a coach invests in a direction, it can be difficult to pivot. Admitting something isn't working often comes with consequences, internally and externally. So instead of adjusting early, the system keeps pushing forward, hoping things eventually click. And then there's the perspective that raises the most eyebrows. The idea that this wasn't just about belief, but control. Again, this is speculation, but some voices around the situation have suggested that the structure of the quarterback room felt too rigid, too predetermined, like certain outcomes were being protected rather than naturally earned. If that's even partially true, it changes everything. Because then, it's no longer about competition. It's about direction. And when direction overrides performance, the entire evaluation process gets questioned. Now look at how quickly things shifted once Atlanta entered the picture. The Atlanta Falcons had a clean slate, a chance to build their quarterback room without any of the previous baggage. And what did they do? They went in a completely different direction. No strong push for Gabriel, no urgency to bring him in, no continuation of that earlier belief. That contrast is hard to ignore. Because if Stefanski truly viewed Gabriel as a long-term solution, why doesn't that show up now in a new environment? Why does it feel like a reset instead of a continuation? That's what turns this from a simple misjudgment into something more complicated. Because either the evaluation changed very quickly, or the original evaluation wasn't as solid as it seemed. And neither explanation looks great. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of those decisions are still being felt, especially by ShedeurSanders. Because if the system was tilted, even slightly, if opportunities weren't as balanced as they could have been, then the impact goes beyond one season. It affects perception. It affects development. It affects how a player is viewed across the league. And those are consequences that don't disappear overnight. So now the focus shifts back to Stefanski, not just as a coach, but as a decision-maker under pressure. Because the margin for error at that level is thin. And when a situation like this starts, getting picked apart from every angle, it doesn't just follow you. It defines you. Which raises one final thought that's starting to gain traction. Was this simply a mistake that got out of control? Or the kind of decision that quietly shapes the rest of a career? Because whatever the answer is, the league is watching now. And while all the noise, speculation, and shifting narratives continue to swirl, there's one side of this story that keeps pulling attention back to it. The perspective of ShedeurSanders. Because no matter how you look at this situation, whether you believe it was misjudgment, system bias, or just unfortunate timing, his name keeps coming up for a reason. He's the one many feel never got a full shot. Now, to be fair, nothing in the NFL is guaranteed. Every player has to earn their place. Every rep matters. Every opportunity is competitive. But what's been fueling this conversation is the growing belief that those opportunities weren't exactly equal. There's been a lot of talk online, with fans and analysts pointing out moments where Shedeur showed flashes, quick reads, composure under pressure, the ability to extend plays. The kind of traits teams look for when evaluating long-term potential. And yet, those moments often felt isolated. Short bursts instead of sustained chances. Drives instead of full games. Opportunities that came with immediate pressure to prove everything at once. That's a tough position for any quarterback. Because development usually requires rhythm. It requires time on the field, room to adjust, and the ability to learn through mistakes. But according to what's being discussed, that rhythm never fully came together. Instead, it felt like every appearance carried extra weight. Like one mistake could reset everything. Meanwhile, the conversation around Dillon Gabriel seemed to follow a different tone. More patience, more runway, more belief in long-term growth. Again, nothing officially confirmed, but the contrast in perception is what's driving this entire narrative. And perception, especially in a league like this, can shape reality faster than anything else. Because once a player is labeled a certain way, whether it's not ready, inconsistent, or needs more time, that label tends to stick, regardless of the context behind it. That's why this moment feels so important for Shedeur. Because despite everything being said, there's still a strong sense that his story isn't fully written yet. In fact, some would argue it's just getting started. He's shown enough to stay on the radar, enough to keep people watching, enough to make teams wonder what he could look like in a system that fully commits to him. And that what if is powerful. Because if the limitations around his opportunities were even partially real, then there's another version of him that hasn't been seen yet. A version with more control, more confidence, more consistency. And if that version ever gets a clear runway, the narrative flips instantly. Suddenly, the conversation isn't about what he didn't do. It's about what he was never allowed to fully show. That's why so many eyes are quietly tracking his next move. Because situations like this tend to create something rare in the league, a player with something to prove, and a story that people are already invested in. And those are the players who tend to break through in a big way when the moment finally lines up. So while the focus has been on coaching decisions, roster moves, and shifting priorities, don't lose sight of the one element that could change everything. Because if ShedeurSanders gets a real, uninterrupted opportunity, this entire narrative might not just look different. It might completely reverse. And then comes the part of the story that's hardest to ignore. The reality check. Because while the conversation has been filled with speculation, coaching decisions, and behind-the-scenes questions, at some point everything circles back to one thing. What actually happened on the field? And for Dillon Gabriel, that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Coming into the situation, there was clear belief in him, a system that seemed to favor his style, a coach willing to give him chances to grow into the role. On paper, it looked like the perfect setup. But when the opportunities came, the results didn't consistently follow. There were flashes, sure, moments where things looked promising, but they were often overshadowed by stretches where the offense struggled to find rhythm. Timing felt off, reads looked rushed, pressure situations didn't always end well. Nothing that can't happen to a developing quarterback, but the issue was frequency. Because when those struggles show up repeatedly, the conversation starts to shift. At first, it's patience. Then it becomes concern. And eventually, it turns into doubt. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. That shift is exactly what seems to have happened here. Fans began questioning whether the production matched the support he was receiving, whether the extended opportunities were still justified, whether the gap between expectation and performance was getting too wide to ignore. And once that doubt sets in, it's hard to reverse, especially in a situation where comparisons are unavoidable. Because every time Gabriel had a rough stretch, the discussion naturally circled back to ShedeurSanders. What would it have looked like if the roles were reversed? What if those same reps, those same chances, those same moments to settle in, had gone to someone else? That question kept growing louder. And then came the moment that made everything hit harder. The lack of interest from the Atlanta Falcons. Because nothing sends a clearer message than a team choosing not to act. No aggressive move, no visible urgency, no sign that they saw Gabriel as a priority option moving forward. In a league where teams are constantly searching for quarterback talent, silence like that stands out. It suggests hesitation. It suggests uncertainty. And in some cases, it suggests that what was seen on film didn't inspire enough confidence. Now, to be fair, one team's decision doesn't define a player's entire career. Situations change. Systems matter. Development isn't always linear. But timing matters too. And right now, the timing of this shift feels significant. Because it didn't happen quietly over time. It happened right after a stretch where questions were already building. That's what turns this into a true, reality check moment. Not necessarily the end of the road, but a point where perception catches up with performance. Where belief has to be re-earned. Where the narrative resets. And that's a difficult place to be for any player. Because now, instead of being seen as the future, you're being evaluated all over again. And in a league that moves fast, those second chances don't always come easy. Which is why this moment matters so much. Because while the spotlight has shifted away from Gabriel for now, it hasn't disappeared. It's just waiting. Waiting to see if he can respond. Waiting to see if this was just a setback. Or the turning point that defines everything that comes next. And when you zoom out from the individual players, the stats, and the decisions, the story starts to look even bigger than just one team or one situation. Because this isn't just about Dillon Gabriel or ShedeurSanders anymore. It's about what this entire situation represents across the league. The NFL is built on evaluation. Coaches, scouts, executives, they're all constantly making judgment calls that can shape careers overnight. And most of the time, those decisions stay internal. But every once in a while, something leaks into the public eye that forces people to question how those decisions are really made. This feels like one of those moments. Because when a situation raises questions about opportunity, development, and fairness, even if it's all speculative, it creates ripple effects beyond just one locker room. Other teams notice. Players notice. Agents definitely notice. And suddenly, the conversation isn't just about performance, it's about trust. Trust in the system. Trust in coaching decisions. Trust that when a player earns an opportunity, it will actually be there. That's why situations like this can quietly influence how organizations are viewed around the league. Take the involvement of Kevin Stefanski, for example. Right now, his decisions are being analyzed from every angle, not just by fans, but by people inside the league who understand how quickly narratives can shift. Because if there's even a perception that a quarterback room wasn't handled evenly, that perception can follow a coach longer than any single season. And now, with the focus shifting to the Atlanta Falcons, the pressure only increases. New team, new environment, fresh start. But also higher expectations. Because any similar pattern, any sign of uneven opportunity, questionable rotations, or unclear direction won't go unnoticed this time. In fact, it'll be magnified. People will be watching closely to see how this quarterback room is handled, how decisions are made, how opportunities are distributed. Because now there's a reference point. Now there's a before to compare it to. And that's what makes this moment so important. It's not just about what already happened, it's about what happens next. Because if things go smoothly in Atlanta, the narrative might fade. But if similar questions start to pop up again, then this won't look like an isolated situation. It'll look like a pattern. And patterns are what define reputations in the NFL. At the same time, this situation also highlights something deeper about quarterback development as a whole. how fragile it is, how much it depends not just on talent, but on timing, structure, and trust. Because two players can be in the same room, under the same system, and walk away with completely different outcomes, simply based on how they're managed. That's the part that resonates across the league. And it's why stories like this don't just disappear. They stick. They get remembered. They get brought up in future decisions, future evaluations, future opportunities. So while the headlines might focus on one team or one coach, the impact stretches much further. Because right now, whether people admit it or not, the league is paying attention, watching how this unfolds, waiting to see if it was just a one-time situation, or the beginning of something that could reshape how decisions like this are viewed moving forward. And when everything is laid out, the reactions, the decisions, the missed opportunities, and the sudden shift in direction, it becomes clear this was never just a simple quarterback situation. This was a turning point, not just for Dillon Gabriel, not just for ShedeurSanders, but for how people now view the decisions surrounding Kevin Stefanski. Because moments like this don't fade quietly. They linger. They follow players, coaches, and organizations long after the headlines move on. And right now, there are more questions than answers. Why was one direction pushed so hard, only to be abandoned so quickly? Why did one player seem to have the runway, while another was left trying to prove everything in fragments? And most importantly, what does that say about how this situation was handled from the start? There's been a lot of speculation, a lot of opinions, and it's important to remember not everything being said has been confirmed. But perception matters. And the perception right now is powerful. It's the idea that something didn't fully add up. That maybe, just maybe, the story we saw on the surface wasn't the full story behind the scenes. And those kinds of questions don't disappear, they build. They grow louder over time, especially if what happens next doesn't line up with what people expect. Because now, all eyes shift to what comes next. For Gabriel, this becomes a moment of response, a chance to reset the narrative, to prove that this was just a setback, not a definition of who he is as a player. For Stefanski, the margin for error gets smaller. Every decision in his new environment will be watched, analyzed, and compared to what happened before. And for Shedeur, this might be the most important moment of all. Because sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs come after the biggest questions. He's already part of a conversation that people care about, already in a position where the spotlight is waiting for him to step into it fully. And if that opportunity comes, if he gets a real, uninterrupted chance to lead, to develop, to show everything people believe he has, then everything changes. The narrative flips. The doubts disappear. And what once looked like a missed opportunity turns into something much bigger. A statement. That's why this story isn't over. Not even close. Because the real outcome won't be decided by what already happened. It'll be decided by what happens next. By who rises when the opportunity finally comes. By who proves the noise wrong. And by who takes control of a narrative that, right now, is still being written in real time. So as the dust settles and the league keeps watching, one thing is certain. This wasn't just a situation. It was the beginning of something. And the next chapter, it might be the one that changes everything.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.